Ariel Ezrachi, very warm welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. I was waiting for this conversation for quite a long time because you inspire so many people and you provoke others as well in the area of competition law and policy. You are an established authority in terms of academic impact, policy making impact. You teach competition law for ages. People know your output in terms of textbooks and other teaching facilities. But we will be discussing today mainly your vision. And when we talk about the vision, the first thing which comes up in terms of your latest papers is the paper which epitomizes a new kind of era, new junction, let's say, in the development of competition policy, namely Sponge. The paper which somehow broke many stereotypes and challenged many conventional wisdoms, published in Journal of Antitrust Enforcement at the time where the vision of the more economic approach was the reine Sprache, so to say. Let us start with the paper, and maybe you can highlight the key messages, key observations, and also B, to reflect how they are being developed after the publication of the paper, which is quite already, I think, seven years or so.
Yeah, so Oles, thank you for inviting me to join. It's a pleasure, and I know we've been discussing it for a while, so it's nice that we can at last have an opportunity to sit and chat. Well, the sponge paper, I think, at the time when it was evolving, it was mostly because there was a sense that you had leading jurisdictions that would look at other jurisdictions applying their national antitrust and competition laws and criticize them for getting it wrong. So there was a sense that there is a truth, a certain norm of antitrust, which is the correct way of enforcing competition law. And if you don't do that, if you do anything different, then the criticism arrived quite quickly, both at political level, but also at agency level. You misunderstand what antitrust should be. So the sponge paper was not an attempt to advocate the sponginess of competition law. It wasn't an attempt to say, oh, competition law should be more inclusive, which is something that maybe since then evolved, and today you will have people that argue for a greater inclusiveness. The paper itself just reflects the state of things. The idea is to look at this legal regime and just identify what it is. And the first thing about it, that it is a legal construct. So the arguments that say that there is a pure form of competition law ignore completely the fact that every jurisdiction has a different legislation, and legislation by its nature reflects the social and political context. And legislation has different goals for competition law. In some jurisdictions, like the EU, you would have very detailed list of goals and values that competition law arguably serves to promote. And in other jurisdictions, you might have something that is a bit more abstract, that speaks about competitiveness of markets or consumer well-being. And just those differences in the structure, the interface, immediately dictate a slightly different application of the law. And it is sometimes misleading because we are all speaking the same language. There is a common DNA to competition law around the world. After all, we rely on very similar economic theories. We all share very similar ideas about the theories of harm, the appropriate limiting principles. And the paper just highlights that. It highlights that this is a social construct and therefore it is inherently different. It also highlights another thing, that economics is not value-free. So the other idea that, okay, competition law might be a little bit vague in its scope and goals when you look at it from a global perspective, but here economics came and it offers us a rigid certainty. So let's all align with economics. That's not true either. The paradigms at the base of economic analysis may be questioned, and whichever economic vision you take, from the idea of the extent to which markets will self-correct, to the extent to which consumers are rational, to your base assumptions, all these things also reflect value judgments. And the result is that we have an area of law that is extremely useful, extremely central to our modern livelihood and markets, but is not aligned completely between jurisdictions. And once you identify or you accept the sponginess of the regime, it becomes much easier to have an international dialogue, because it is not about someone being right and someone being wrong. It is about appreciating that you might be in a different stage of your journey. What might work for one jurisdiction? Think of developed and developing jurisdictions. That's always the easiest way to think of it. What might be the right thing for a developed jurisdiction in terms of emphasis on the nature of competition might be slightly different for a developing economy, and of course between jurisdictions. So you have differences along the way and differences between jurisdictions. So that's the paper, and I was delighted that it was so well received, because I truly believe that. I believe that we can have a much more fruitful and honest discussion once we move beyond a very simplistic argument that someone is right and someone is wrong, and we really understand the construct that we work with.
I think it's an excellent observation and clarification about the idea of the paper is that it's a descriptive. It's not a kind of a proposition to change the to launch a new revolution. It's a descriptive, positivistic, almost natural scientific analysis, explication of the nature of law and legal systems, how they interact with society, how they absorb inherently, regardless of the institutional settings, how they absorb the values, interests, and circumstances. But this, however, has been instrumentalized, this injection of relativism into the canonical beliefs in the omnipotence of economics, to at least to offer answers. Maybe they are not deliverable by policymakers, but at least the answer, the clear, correct, truthful answers exist, have been so the challenge in the status quo has been instrumentalized, including by myself, I would say. And we can say that now the abandoning of the holistic vision of competition policy and kind of Bretton Woods vision of universal competition policy underpinned by the universal language of law and economics is being challenged, I would say successfully. But now we have another challenge, that this relativism, the gene or virus of relativism can get contagious and can spread and mutate. So do we need to think of a recipe about the enthusiasm with which some jurisdiction or some thinkers try to interpret the specific circumstances of each jurisdiction, specific interest, and go too far?
So you're absolutely right. I think what was a descriptive exercise has since been used slightly differently. So the starting point, I would argue, would still be just to appreciate that different legal regimes will have different scope in terms of what they enable their competition provisions to do. So there is a very distinct difference between what the legislation offers you and then what the agencies do with that. And usually agencies tend to stay in their comfort zone. So even if the law enables them to take additional values into account, they don't always do that, because it is much easier to look at what you can count and then treat that. So, and the outcome, of course, is that you might have a very technocratic approach to antitrust. So the first thing is that the law often doesn't need to change. What needs to change is your understanding of how you use the margin of discretion that is given to you by the law. The second thing I would say is that there should be an understanding, and I think everyone in the discussion understands that competition law is not a panacea. It's not that competition law is something that can solve everything, but it is something that has traditionally been used as a gap filler for various reasons. And I always think of it like those You know, when you go to a DIY shop and you have this foam that you can buy that just expands, it's very much like this. Now, we might be in favor of it or against it, but what competition law has enabled governments and agencies was to sometimes identify a problem and approach it from a market perspective. But what I would say is that it cannot have endless objectives. And this is where I go back to the idea of the foam that you buy. The foam that you buy at the DIY shop can maybe fill a certain gap. But if you try to fill a massive gap, it just collapses inwards. And that's the warning that I would sound, that a lot of values can be taken into account. Privacy, data protection, sustainability, of course. It is about understanding that you have key objectives, you have values that you take into account and may serve to advance the key objectives, but it is about retaining some sort of hierarchy, retaining an understanding of what it is that you're trying to do. So competition law can be the key instrument to advance certain goals. It can be an instrument that take into account other values. And then you have an open debate, and I think it's an important and lively debate, as you see that as we change, as our reality change, our economy change, certain values that may have been influential start to shift to become a goal. And that's a process that, of course, is extremely challenging. Everyone accepts it. It is extremely challenging because it affects the boundaries, the analytical boundaries of what competition law is about. As long as you do it in a transparent manner, as long as you do it and you publish guidelines, as long as you do it gradually, as long as you do it in order to keep competition law relevant, I think this is a process that is natural to what competition law is about. But as you embark in that or on that trajectory, you would probably see greater inconsistencies between jurisdictions, because you're also moving away from the common DNA, which has been economic analysis. So you can find an agency that will take certain ideas into account, where another agency might consider them, but maybe at a lesser extent. That's just part of reality. It's not a massive difference from where we were 30 years ago or 60 years ago. It's just another round of this process where you have certain types of assimilation, and then you have slight disharmony, slight system friction, you go back to assimilation, and it's just an ongoing process.
Continue with the analogy of DIY shop and construction. What do you think, would you also assign the same mission and the same limits to the new competition tool, which has been kind of annexed to the main building of competition law? It's something which has been built using different materials, different architectural planning, and envisaging already greater discretion. Would you extend this warning or against excessive enthusiasm also to those enforcing the DMA, or it's a completely or it's a different animal with different genes and thus different mission, etc.?
It's all completely different, but it is a different mechanism that is used to achieve a similar goal. So there is a certain understanding that ex post analysis by large is extremely valuable, but have certain limitations. So you mentioned the DMA, so let's just touch a little bit about what is the DMA. If you go back 10 years, there are statements from the commission that say, oh, this digital revolution is challenging, but we have the tools. Competition law is enough. Those are the statements for the commission. So what led to the change? What led to the change was the realization of the limits of competition law. After all, if you have an ex post tool, mostly, I mean, leaving mergers aside, if you have an ex post tool and digital works, let's say 3 times faster than typical industry, and you're always behind because you're reactive, so you're 3 times slower than the industry, and you have the courts that, because of case law and precedents, are 3 times possibly slower behind you, you have such a gap. It's like a heavy tanker that you want to turn. And from the moment that you decided to execute the turn, it might take an hour before you can complete that turn of this heavy tanker. And those limitations led to alternative mechanisms of enforcement, not alternative ideology, but alternative mechanisms of enforcement. If competition law was working well, if the deterrent was there, you would have assumed that a single case that identifies a certain conduct as abusive will immediately generate a certain ripple effect, and everyone would align. That wasn't the case. Why? Because of the limitations of antitrust analysis, because of the multiple junctions in which you can challenge certain assertions when it comes to the theory of harm, the effect, and all these things are extremely valuable. So the DMA came as an amplifying mechanism. The DMA is a bypass that bypasses some of the challenges that you have. But what it really does, it just takes, it's a very prescriptive formula that takes what are conducts that we consider to be problematic and amplify the message. So is it different? Yes, it is a completely different mechanism, but it is not completely detached from the overall goal. It stems from the understanding of the limitation of antitrust, and it is using a different mechanism. And there is a whole debate of whether that mechanism is over-permissive, too open, too narrow. That, that is on its own is a debate that one can spend hours discussing. And if you think about market investigations or various tools in that respect, they're somewhere in between. It's not exactly the DMA, but it is an attempt to be able to look at a market more holistically, identify what are the limitations that might undermine competition, how we can encourage entry. So it's somewhere in between. But again, it is not a separate tool. So in my mind, at least, I imagine antitrust as setting the tone, and then additional tools are either used to advance the very same goals using slightly different means, up to the point where you move to a regulatory regime that operates in parallel, but is not detached, because you can find the origins of that tool very easily when you look at the journey that led to the creation of the DMA. At least when we speak about the DMA, of course, other regulatory tools might look at slightly wider areas.
This is very consistent with the sponge. So Ariel Ezrachi, quite descriptive scientist, has demonstrated his understanding of the role of competition law and policy ex post and the DMA, new competition tool, whatever the market investigations, etc. But there is also Ariel Ezrachi, who writes in tandem with Maurice Stucke mainly on the issues from more normative perspective. So how the things should be, rather than purely strictly in juristic competition law vocabulary and apparatus and scope. And there are several books which have triggered the discussions around different issues, starting from virtual competition and to competition over doors, big tech barons, and several others. So I propose to start thematically with the book Competition Over Doors, and one of the key messages in the book is the distinction between toxic and noble competition, which is something which is misunderstood by some, overinterpreted by others, and thus, can you please explain to us the idea and how you operationalize it?
Yeah. Okay. So we're moving from an attempt to, as you say, to describe to a more proactive stance in terms of looking at what is happening around us and trying to make sense of it all. And competition overdose starts with the appreciation that the process of competition benefits us immensely, okay? Greater welfare, greater prosperity, there's no doubt about it. Markets generate more welfare and less errors than governments. Okay, so once we clear that, let's try to understand why is there an overdose? And what happened is that over the years, we overdose on the ideal of competition. You have a problem with your schools. The solution, the political solution, has often been, let's introduce competition. So we outsource a lot of the problems that we have to the market, assuming that the market will save us. You have a problem with water supply, let's introduce competition. You want more of something, introduce competition. You want better airplanes, have more intense competition, and that will resolve everything. And indeed, many times, competition is the answer, no doubt about that. But when you take a very simplistic view of competition, what happens is that you just increase the pressure within this fairness. You increase the pressure, and you don't take account of other dimensions of competition, because you take a very theoretical perspective that competition will always deliver welfare. So you don't notice the cracks. And when you don't notice the cracks, you ignore issues, for instance, of quality, service, other dimensions of competition. You ignore the fact that some types of competition, zero-sum competition, toxic competition, can yield results that are not aligned with our interest as a society. And this is what the book is looking at. It is looking at instances where competition dynamics, although valuable, have been deployed in a way that does not benefit us as a society. Now, when you speak with economists, they say it's a no-brainer. They agree. Economists that understand this thesis, of course, there are market failures. There are instances that competition will not deliver the benefits that we desire. So where is the failure? The failure is when the idea of competition is often being used or abused by people that use it. They use the slogan, it is pro-competitive, to enable activities that are actually not pro-consumer or pro-society or pro-welfare. And this is where you have the breaking point. And there are lots of examples. So it can be, if you think about liberalization, think about competition between prisons, privatizing the idea of prison services, which can be an excellent thing, but then the way you reward that competition is not done with sufficient thought and care. So you start to award people for the number of days that they host a prisoner. You create adverse incentives. We have lots of stories in the book from the US where prisons engage proactively in keeping prisoners in jail. Prisons do not invest in rehabilitation. You have stories about bribes given to judges. So you basically created a system that in a very simplistic sense, you assume this will be great, but it just went on and on to backfire, to create toxicity. Let's move to something that has nothing to do with liberalization, competition between universities. So you would think that this is a great thing, and of course it is. But what type of competition? And one of the things we cover in the book is ranking between US universities. And one of the elements at the time was that your prestige is determined by the number of people that you reject. Once that was set as a parameter, what did many universities do? They started encouraging people that have no chance in studying in those institutions to apply. So you have representatives from universities going to schools across the US and telling kids that they should apply, despite knowing extremely well that there is no chance that they will accept students at that level of academic excellence. And there is a funny anecdote in the book. Maurice dog, we took her name and we put her name on the automated system, just her name of his dog. And without any details, we didn't mislead, we just put her name on the system. And after a few weeks, his dog started getting letters, and we have a scan of one of the letters in the book, where you have universities saying, we read your file, you're amazing. We would like to give you a scholarship. Please apply. And just remember, we're talking about a dog. Please apply. I mean, it's all nonsense. And that is a type of competition that doesn't yield the benefits that you would expect. So by increasing the pressure, but assuming, making a very simple assumption that markets will always deliver, you will often find yourself in a situation where competition rather than benefit us. And remember, why is it that we champion competition? Not for the sake of rivalry, but because we have this very basic assumption that when we put pressures on companies, they improve the service, they improve the quality, and they lower the price. We have efficiencies and we have innovation. So our whole economy is based on an idea that more competition will deliver more for us. And what we highlight is that as you increase the pressure, you have to position some guardrails that will ensure that this dynamic, this trajectory will continue to work in our favor. And I'll give you last example. At the time, this was when we had the tragedy with the Boeing 737 MAX, the crashes. And of course, there are many reasons for those crashes, but one of them is competition. There is a whole backstory of when the pressure on Boeing was so intense to deliver the 737 MAX that led to instructions that affected the type of training given to pilots and eventually led to pilots not being aware that there is a program that automated the reaction that eventually led to the crash of the two airplanes. And part of that story is the story of competition, where there is an assumption that when you put the pressure, the companies, because of the pressure of competition, will be more efficient, more innovative, and will always, because we punish them as consumers, will always make sure to maintain high quality. But it doesn't always happen. Boeing is an excellent example, just as us in Europe eating horse meat in our burgers is an example of quality degradation that happened because of intense competition. So this is not an attempt to argue for less competition. It is an attempt to explain that if you overdose on the ideal without understanding the limitations, then you may find yourself in situations where the competitive process backfires. And we have this spectrum where we identify different types of competition, and we also identify the ideal. You mentioned noble competition. And so if you have positive sum competition, that's the competition we all aspire to. But if you imagine noble competition, there the idea is that if you are the game maker, if you are the one who sets the tone, this is the type of competition that you want. You want competition where it is measured against the benefit that it delivers to society. Do we benefit from that competitive process? Now, of course, if you and I compete, each one of us will compete in order to win. It is not something that you and I, as the competitors, will think about, but it is something that those who design the process of competition, they shouldn't just throw in the idea of intense rivalry is always delivering without understanding that you need to add certain values of fair competition, of what is the right level of competition. How do you protect people that are injured by competition so you create a healthier society? So these are the ideas in competition overdose.
And if you try to bring this vision to practice, so to say, would you expect this understanding of the nature of competition and mainly its shaping, its implementation and tailoring? Is it a matter primarily for the enforcers, or maybe it's something which the judges also have to be mindful of while primarily on 50-50 cases? Is this criterion of novelty versus toxicity, it's purely for us to understand better the very, actually it's not about the very phenomenon, because toxic competition is as competition as noble competition. So we're not talking about the phenomenon of competition, but implications on society and other non-competition things. So please comment. I see you want to say something.
No, it's a great question. I think at the highest level, it is about the politicians and the policymakers. So when you look at a service, rather than outsource your problem as a government to the market and assume that this is a magical solution, it is about understanding the limitations of the process. Or if you're lobbied to allow something to create a certain dynamic of competition, it is about understanding the limitations and at the very least, putting in place guardrails or putting in place incentives that will ensure that whatever dynamic that you initiated works for us. So you have it at that level of the policy making. You have it at the level of enforcement, because in competition overdose, we discuss platforms and ecosystems and game makers. It is the understanding that whoever controls the process of competition, and in many ways, ecosystems are private autonomies where there is a private marketplace where all of us interact. Sometimes it's about data, sometimes it's about buying products. It is about understanding the power that those entities have in determining the type of competition. Competition as a dynamic is not a singular type of engagement. There is the ability of determining the type of competition. There is an ability to determine whether it is distorted or whether it serves us. So once you move beyond the simplistic idea that competition is just competition, you understand the responsibility that goes along the different levels of control. And of course, it is also for judges, for courts, for enforcement agencies, when they just consider certain types of competition. Maybe sometimes if you have, for example, a race to the bottom that requires someone to step in and stop this spiraling effect, maybe that should be allowed. So it takes you away from a very simplistic per se approach that says anything that is pro-competitive is always celebrated and everything that is anti is always bad, which is in 98% of the cases true, to a more nuanced approach where you say, look, we found ourselves in a situation, for example, that US universities are spending money that should be spent on academic studies on something that is in the ranking, be it the stadiums that they invest in, or be it how much they pay the coaches of the football team. Maybe because they are in a race to the bottom where they just cannot stop, no one can de-escalate. Maybe we should de-escalate. Maybe there is a need for an external input, and maybe not. I'm not here to make a judgment on a case-by-case level. I'm just highlighting that once you understand that this is not just a magical medicine that will always work, just like any medicine, if you overdose on it, you're not better off. In fact, you can be worse off. That is the message.
And another example, well, first of all, I really liked how the university informed the dog, Maurice's dog, that there will be compulsory consideration for your scholarship. That was really, the message, which was like, oh my God, that's so shockingly, tailored by speech writers or whatever, the marketologists. And another interesting example of the race of the bottle, which triggers kind of almost nostalgic feelings, the ice hockey competition without helmets, yeah, and only recently the latest player who was allowed to play without the helmet graduate or retired. This somehow shows to us how we should learn from professional sporting leagues who fight successfully against doping, which is essentially competition. It's a race to the bottom, and many other examples where they are much more flexible. They are motivated by commercial interests, of course. But is it the case that public authorities, those who will want to tailor more noble competition or channel competition in a more noble direction, or be mindful of harms of toxic competition, should maybe look more often at the mechanisms and flexibility, how professional leagues in Europe and in North America primarily, I imagine, maybe somewhere else as well, are managing these similar, typologically similar issues as well.
Sometimes, I mean, because you might not always celebrate the way that sporting bodies approach some of the problems that they encounter. But I think in principle, I would agree. It is about understanding, in the case of a race to the bottom, that you need to de-escalate because there is no winning. Basically, everyone wins. And in the hockey game, what you see is that the players lose. So in the hockey games, if I assume that not wearing a helmet gives me an advantage, I don't wear a helmet, you don't wear a helmet. At the end, no one is better off, and all of us are worse off. But at the university, what you have the third parties, you have the kids, the students, their parents, their families. So no one is better off between the universities because they all encourage people to apply regardless, and they cannot stop. But now you have the side effect, which is massive on the well-being of people that are basically being sold hopes for nothing, just for profit motive. And you could extend that if you think about social media and the way we reward negativity, or the way we reward, and it's the same thing. We enable a certain dynamic, and in those instances, there is a whole group that suffers from those dynamics. And then sometimes you might think that maybe it's time for us to try and intervene to just stop this spiraling effect. The problem that you would have is that in every competitive dynamic that you see, there will be winners and losers. And the winners of the status quo will, of course, lobby you and try to convince you not to change anything. Sometimes the losers will try to convince you that something that is completely benign is problematic to engage to, and different people might have different backgrounds and different ideas about what competition law is about, or what competition is about, or what is the role of government, or what is the role of markets. One of the things you realize is that despite us talking about competition law and economics, going back to this discussion of the sponge, it is about ideology. What the environment in which you were raised and the type of education to which you were exposed truly affect the way you think about competition. And because it is so engraved in who we are, it's not even something that you can say, oh, so let me imagine that I stand behind a veil of ignorance. How would I behave? No, it's not even about that, because it goes to the core of who you are, your beliefs. It's something that is so hard for us to separate. It's not about thinking, what if I wasn't rich? It is about your understanding of the dynamics of the world around you. And I think one thing for all of us to accept is that we don't share a common view. Different people, and it's perfectly fine. Different people may have different views about how economies work and how they should work.
The next impactful book is Big Tech Barons, where one of the main arguments is the role of innovation in digital markets primarily, but we can probably extrapolate it beyond as well. We often hear one of the ideological arguments, or rather not raised by big tech themselves, but rather by those who amplify the message, their societal or their normative interest, that the proactive approach kills incentives and innovation will go elsewhere, and where should you draw the limit? So the role of innovation was seen, at least in the past, as categorically positive value. You brought some shades to it. Please explain.
So this is the third book that Maurice and I authored together, and it's How Big Tech Barons Smash Innovation. And it started actually with a report that we wrote for the European Commission about innovation. And as we were working to look at innovation in the digital economy, we started to see things that, when you start, you don't know exactly what you're going to unravel. And this is where we started to realize that there is a view of innovation in competition law that misses a lot of nuances in terms of the type of innovation that it is advanced in digital markets. So let's start with the fact that, of course, innovation is important, and needless to say, you try to avoid intervention that would limit competition, chill competition, or chill innovation. It's a no-brainer. No one wants to kill the patient. Okay. But we make a certain assumption that if you invested 6 billion in research and development, we celebrate it. Okay, we clap our hands and we say, this is incredible. And what we don't do is appreciate the impact that certain companies have on the nature of innovation, on the trajectory of innovation, the heterogeneity of innovation, and our future. And this is what we looked at in the book. So the book really tries to look at all these elements. So first, it is about understanding that when you look at ecosystems or very large platforms, understand all the levers that they have to impact innovation. If I'm a user and I'm logged into a certain platform, I'm basically subjected to their decision-making in terms of which innovations will I meet within that ecosystem. So if you, for instance, develop a payment system that is innovative and amazing, it is only if the platform or ecosystem will allow you entry, let's say to the app shop or to sell that system, that I will even be able to purchase that innovation. And if your innovation is disruptive, or if your innovation competes with innovation that was developed by the platform, what often happens is that you will not gain access, or you will gain access that is subjected to some terms and conditions, or maybe to self-favoritism of the platform's own services and own innovation. So the first thing that you see is that when we go into an ecosystem, it is not an organic market where if there is innovation around us, we will just hear about it. There is a filter that determines what type of innovation reaches the market. This affects the supply of innovation. Then you have the demand of innovation. We all tend to have a sense that we walk with a lot of autonomy on a path that we chose. But in reality, and we discussed that in virtual competition, and I think today there is a realization by many, there are so many levers that are used to influence our decision-making, from introducing friction between you and certain options to reducing friction or using dark patterns to convince you to take certain actions. So we're walking down a path that was designed for us, leading us many times to a certain destination, which means that also the demand for innovation is impacted. Think about sideloading if you're on Android. You want to sideload something, but you get constant warnings, even if this is a safe source, that are trying to inhibit you sideloading and convince you to load within the ecosystem. And that's just one example. So within the ecosystem, you control the demand and supply for innovation, which means that you can determine the trajectory of innovation. And then the question is, so what happens outside the ecosystem? And what you start to realize is that because investors try to invest in technologies that will make it to the market, if you are not under the light that is generated by the ecosystem of technologies that are part of the value chain and will enhance the value chain, if you're a disruptor, it's actually quite difficult for you to operate. So there is an incentive outside the ecosystem where disruptors, although we dream about them and we're told daily, disruption is behind the corner. The disruptor in the garage is a myth. A disruptor needs investment, and investors will only invest in something that will reach the market or that will be so disruptive that it will be bought by someone else in order to kill it, which is a legitimate exit strategy. And what you see is that there is an ongoing campaign that determines the trajectory of innovation. We see less disruption. We see more and more complementing innovation, which is great, but it is not the type of innovation that we necessarily want as a society. The heterogeneity of innovation is affected. And with power, what you also identify is that the type of innovation changes. In a simplistic model, when I innovate and you are the customer, I innovate in order to satisfy your needs. So the market generates the innovation that you desire. But in a complex multi-side market, we, the customers, are just one party. And if most of the innovation is addressed, and if we think about the advertising value chain, is addressed at targeting, capturing, manipulating, and selling, then this is where the investment goes. So market power in a multi-sided market, when the income is not generated from consumers directly, results in more investments in innovations that as a society we shouldn't celebrate. You shouldn't necessarily celebrate innovation that enables an algorithm now just by reading your text, classifying your emotional state. You shouldn't celebrate innovation that can now determine by the way you type on your keyboard how you can best be targeted. You shouldn't celebrate innovation that is able to manipulate young kids. And yet in antitrust, we don't have the qualitative dimension of innovation. And that is the problem. And we go into that in quite a lot of detail, trying to understand the sources of toxic innovation, why it is so difficult to deal with toxic innovation, and what it is that you can do in an attempt both to improve enforcement, so we take account of that, but also support policies where you can encourage disruption, because at the end, our future depends very much on there being a wide, heterogeneous range of innovations that can satisfy different needs.
On purely prescriptive side, how would you see, and taking digital markets as an example where we have more or less proactive tools, if you have 2 or 3 gatekeepers in a specific market who can exploit and engage in all toxic practices, which are obviously innovative in some sense, because you cannot be a successful company without innovation, but these innovations are channeled to the benefits of not the, as you explained. By bringing more players to the game, should they necessarily be disruptors? Should they come from, or maybe if it's a competition between inter-ecosystem competition itself will bring more responsibility, accountability, and the fact that they are 6 gatekeepers would somehow, and again, it's closed professional league with no promotion relegation, because the entrance is so expensive, you need computational capacities, all this. Should we be satisfied with the fact knowing that some gatekeepers try to operationalize the DMA and channel the focus of enforcers to specific instance of non-compliance by their competitors, other gatekeepers, and those gatekeepers do it vice versa vis-a-vis, let's say, search and cloud or other examples? Or we need disruptors, or again, we need to change the business model. Obviously, it's not either or, but still the focus should be changing the very business model, or rather in allowing the market structure being different.
So as you rightly say, it's all of the above. But if you, and this is what the DMA is trying to do, this is why, if we think about just the recent Google judgment from the US, if you think about the enforcement of competition in Europe, every action that facilitates switchability, facilitate interoperability, sends a signal. So it increases the competitive pressure and send a signal that there is hope for you if you develop something alternative. If I'm captured on your platform, and because of direct and indirect network effects, and because of data and lack of data mobility, I don't really switch. So although I have the theoretical abilities to switch, I don't switch, and I don't multi-home. Then, of course, if you are the main player, that's a very specific signal that is sent out to the market. But if we, through antitrust or regulatory intervention, we enable switchability, data mobility, all the things that are now discussed and debated, what it does, it actually increases the contestability of markets. Once you do that, this in itself nuances the signal that is sent to the market. If previously you and I were sitting and thinking, how do we enter the market? And we thought, if we try to be disruptive, if we try to develop an application that increases privacy, there is no way that we will be allowed in the ecosystem. Disconnect is a case on point. If we now know that there is competition on privacy, real competition on privacy, not just the marketing blurb that we sometimes get, then we will develop that because we will think there is a chance. So you can deal with disruption directly through support policies. You can deal with disruption directly by addressing instances where a disruptor was not allowed into an ecosystem. But you can deal with it more holistically in a way which is looking at the dynamics of competition. You increase the ability or the dynamics of markets, you increase contestability, you increase user mobility, you allow switchability, you try to encourage multi-homing, you try to reduce the instances in which your decision-making is controlled by a single entity. And that in itself will regenerate the market the way we aspire it to regenerate.
A more sociological question, Ariel. Again, related to the books which you have co-authored with Maurice Stucke. Namely, because of the impact of the books, you went far beyond the cluster of competition law, economics and policy people, academics, policymakers, judges, and reached broader audience. And you obviously receive not only panegyrics, you also receive criticism. So maybe you can, and us, we can learn from you, how do you process this criticism? Do you sit and somehow try to filter out things which are completely lunatic and irrelevant, or motivated by some clear agenda, so to say, from those which are suitable and somehow trigger your thinking towards the next book project maybe? So how do you, what is your reaction to different criticism? Do you observe a lot of it?
So I think we were really fortunate with I'm talking here about the 3 books that I co-authored with Maurice. Probably the greatest pushback came from virtual competition, actually, because at the time, virtual competition came out at the time where platforms were still very much saying competition is a click away. And any attempt to intervene was seen as you don't understand competition, you don't understand market. And we tried. So the story in virtual competition deals with algorithmic collusion, behavioral discrimination, and platforms. So 3 elements that we identified as affecting the nature of competition in digital markets. And there, it was a bit of an uphill struggle, because on one hand, it was extremely well received by the press, but you constantly were challenged by, I would say, either certain companies or people that were operating on behalf of those companies. And I think at the time it took us a while to understand how to filter this. It's never fun. And I say we were fortunate because I guess reality aligned with our vision. But the journey, it was, I have to say, it was really great to have the 2 of us, because you need sometimes someone to help you kind of rationalize something when you're in a certain, at a hearing somewhere, and then you have someone who just try to discredit you by explaining something that today, if I'll say it, you will laugh, because we all are in a different reality. But back then it was, how do you convince them of what we see? Competition overdose was extremely well received. So there it's a completely different story. It is, we spoke about it, and we were afraid that it will not, the nuance argument that we make will not be understood, but it was extremely well received, and we felt very fortunate. Of course, there were some people that raised criticism, I think mostly because they, you know, they were firmly with the idea of, you know, governments should not intervene. I mean, something which is a very basic ideological idea, but other people really celebrated it. And I think how big tech barons smashed innovation, also extremely well received in the sense, and when I say extremely well received, I don't mean that you don't have criticism, but in the sense that the majority of people, the people that you really value their input, they get it, they see how this expands our understanding. So, you know, overall, I think we're extremely fortunate to be in such a dynamic area of law, economics, and policy that you can debate things, and we all learn, and of course we all make mistakes. It's not there, you know, no one has a crystal ball. We're all just but these are interesting areas. These are areas that affect our future, our kids' future, the future of markets, the relationship between private power and government power. So it's important stuff.
I'm mindful of time, but there are a few questions I wanted to ask you. Primarily, one of the issues you mentioned recently, the possibility of courts to cool off the enthusiasm of enforcers with this proactive approach to competition policy. Is it the reality which we have to absorb and accept as the only possible for liberal democratic governance, where the judges can tailor and pause and refocus and discourage some practices which are seen as part of the broader policy making endeavor, and thereby fragmenting this comprehensive policy making project, if we talk about the DMA.
So I think courts are essential. I know it might, and you have to remember that, especially if you think about the DMA, by the way, you give a lot of power to an administrator. You want to have the courts. You don't know where you might be tomorrow. You don't know what type of enforcer you would have, whether it would be a responsible enforcer who is self-policing his or hers actions because they understand what they try to do, or whether you might have an agency problem that somehow led whichever enforcer, I'm not talking about specific enforcer, which might lead the enforcer to do something which is not in line with the societal interest. So courts are extremely important. We mentioned earlier the fact that courts will naturally lag behind the enthusiasm of competition agencies, and that is a problem, but it is part of our system. I think because of that limitation, you have these new tools that are being introduced that are trying to accelerate, because maybe some of us, myself included, think that we don't have time to waste. We cannot wait 15 years for a few cases to shift in a way that we can take meaningful action. So because of that, you have sometimes to facilitate the change. But overall, I have no doubt in my mind that it is extremely important to have an effective judicial review of decisions of the enforcers. It is a safeguard. It keeps all of us humble. It makes sure that no one is over-enforcing. It also makes sure that no one is under-enforcing. Now, do we always get it right? No. I think in competition law, there is something very comforting. If we will look at this interview in 10 years, we will probably have a lot of criticism. So you know that by definition, because there isn't an absolute truth, we're probably wrong on some of the things that we think. That's the nature of it. That's just the nature of the animal. But with all the limitations, I'm very much in favor of robust judicial review, but one that will not delay the effectiveness of competition. And in different jurisdictions, you can certainly see how in some jurisdictions, court might have driven enforcement to irrelevance. In certain jurisdictions, court are more susceptible to certain ideas than others. It's a complex landscape.
Absolutely. And two last questions. Traditionally, recommendation to students, but before recommendation to students, maybe also recommendation to mid-career researchers or people who are already established academics, but they are still under the constant pressure, self-imposed or institutionally imposed, to publish, to contribute to policy-making discussions, to generate funding, because the universities ask continuously, and their financial situation is not getting better everywhere. And so there is kind of omnipresent challenge to deliver continuously and at higher level. It's you face this challenge as well as an established professor at Oxford, as all others. So you must develop also a kind of not only a solution of work harder, be more interested, but also some kind of recommendations where to make it more long-standing, continuous, and sustainable.
So I think one of the nice things when you look around you is that you see, and I really like our competition community. I mean, you meet everyone at events and conferences, and by large, it is a supportive community, and you see how different people chose different paths. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all. Different people have different interests. So you see some people went more toward the policy making. Some people went more into kind of the philosophical aspects. And I think that's a great thing. So rather than try to align yourself with a formula, I think try to identify what is it that an individual enjoys. Second thing, in terms of the pressures of universities, I think this is the biggest challenge. At least this is how I experience it, that the institution tends to, the admin burden is immense. And you just have to always try to balance the various aspects of your job. So you need to be a good citizen for the faculty, the wider university, or college. You need to make sure that you have interesting projects, well, hopefully because it's something that you really want to do, or you have something to say. You want to be engaged in conferences and events because you want to meet people and be inspired by their ideas and brilliance and listen to them. So my advice is just always take a step back and just make sure that you have dedicated a little bit of time to each and one of the aspects that form together your career. I think the worst thing one can do is get sucked into one aspect and become, and say, oh, the last 3 years I was in charge of something at my university and therefore I could, or I didn't deal with policy matters because I was so, no, it's everything feeds the other things. So, if you do a bit of policy work, it informs your writing. If you do some writing, it informs other things. So I think a balanced portfolio is a nice thing, personally, to have.
Many thanks indeed, Ariel. And now your recommendation to students, how they would succeed in this very attractive for students in particular field.
Competition law is such an interesting area. I feel so fortunate that I found competition law, because I cannot imagine many other areas where you will have so much excitement. It's a bit overwhelming, to be honest, because so many things happen on a daily basis. But it depends which students. In general, if it's undergraduates or graduate students in taught courses, I think my main advice would be, don't be shy, ask questions. Really, I think the worst thing you can do is be in an environment that is about education and being afraid to sound your voice. The starting assumption should be that we all sometimes say silly things, we all make mistakes. So you might as well ask a question just to make sure that you understand something. And no one has all the answers. So ask questions, and don't be afraid to engage in a discussion, or intimidated by others. And when it comes to research students, I think my main advice always is just not to chase a moving target, which is specifically relevant, I think, also with the digital markets, but also with many other projects that I supervise. Any question, even a question that is in an area that is extremely dynamic, can be approached from different perspectives, and try to take a perspective that gives you some sort of longevity. Because if you start your project and you're lucky and you'll finish it in 3 years, but you're chasing a moving target, it will turn your project into really challenging journey. Whereas if you try to approach it slightly differently, in a way that gives it some longevity, I think it makes your life interesting, and it increases the likelihood that hopefully the book that you will publish will still be relevant in 4 years, rather than, be slightly less on point because regulation changed or something changed, or there is so much enforcement that went through the pipeline, or these type of things. So these would be kind of my general comments.
Ariel Ezrachi, thank you very much indeed for sharing your great ideas with all of us.
My pleasure. Thank you.